Today we're going to be looking at one of the more familiar passages in the entirety of the Bible from the book of Philippians chapter 4, beginning in verse number 10. Isn't it interesting sometimes how life has a way to surprise us? How life has a way of bringing us to difficult places where we experience things we would rather avoid, to where gain gives way to loss. Well, what are we meant to do in those type of circumstances? Well, I was reading this past week a book of golf rules, and it talked about a certain club in Calcutta known as the Calcutta Country Club golf course. And rule number 10 at Calcutta reads like this: play the ball where the monkey drops it. And the background of this rule is that on this beautiful course, it has magnolia trees lining either side. The monkeys that live in the magnolia trees have come to find a game that when someone hits the ball down the fairway, they run out and they grab it. Now, they don't want the ball. They just want to throw it away where people can't seem to find it. And so they have a rule there that says, play the ball where the monkey drops it. And life can sometimes be like playing golf at the Calcutta Country Club. It has a way of sometimes messing up our games plans. And what we tee up for success and hit perfectly down the fairway may be circumstances that take us to be playing in the rough. So how do we deal with things and circumstances that are beyond our control? Things that we cannot affect ourselves but happen unto us. What we're going to look at today is an attitude that helps us to get through this life no matter what it is that we are facing. And it's the art of divine contentment, to where life holds seasons of change, to where when you hold a rose, you run into a thorn. Sometimes the Christian life can be like a mountaintop experience. Some days we're on top of the mountains, and other days the mountains is on top of us. And that's life. How is it that we deal with that? Well, today I want to talk about the attitude and characteristic that will get us through. That of contentment. How do we live out this characteristic in our life that despite not ideal circumstances, we can have a set of attitudes which reflect our relationship with Christ and help to get us through life? Because, friends, life is more attitude than it is aptitude. And Paul shows this to us because he writes these words from a prison. He doesn't write them from an armchair or a seminary classroom, but rather from the belly of a prison cell where his life is hanging in the balance. Yet he tells us that whatever comes his way in life, he will be content. Because he was content in every situation that he found himself. And our call today, as it is every day, is to follow the example of Paul, who was a man for all seasons, and seek to emulate the things that he has in his life. And what he's going to show us through these words today is his response to, as it says in verse 17, a gift that the Philippians had sent him while he was in his imprisonment. A man named Epaphroditus brought this package to Paul that contained either finances or goods to help get him through the difficulty that he was facing. And he's going to write a thank you letter to them. And it begins like this: "But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at last you revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned before, but you lacked opportunity." Paul's great concern in the fact that he received this gift from the church was on the spiritual things rather than the physical things that came along with it. It was a delight to him to see people respond to him and give. That idea of reviving their love for him has with it the idea of a spring that is within bloom, and it brings forth a beautiful, pleasant aroma, a beautiful, pleasant view upon those who look upon it. And when they saw Paul, they saw someone who was in need, and they were willing to give unto him. And what we see is that they provided for Paul in the moment that he needed them the most. And the events of life that we run into, friends, are never accidents. They're always appointments. And in this case, time, distance, a silence of not hearing from one another did not interrupt their care for Paul. But rather they found a new way to love him over 800 miles distance, over 12 years of separation, to bring about a blessing in his life. And what Paul saw was the Lord's hand and their hands, and the Lord's heart and their hearts. And what we can see from this example of Paul, the very first thing that aligns with the idea of being content is that a truly content person will be confident in the providence of God. This whole book is basically a thank you note from Paul to them. But he knew at the moment that he needed what it is that he needed, that the Lord was going to provide. And God provided through these Philippians here today. And because of that, Paul says that he can rejoice greatly. This is the only time in which this entire word appears in the entirety of the New Testament. And what it speaks of is a great joy that Paul had because of the generosity of the church unto him. And when he lifts this up, he uses a unique word because there's nothing like it throughout Scripture that shows the love that this church had for the apostle who found himself in difficult situations. It's a very emphatic and descriptive word that's almost worshipful, and how it is that we see that God was working through the Philippians and the providence of himself to provide for Paul. You know, this idea of greatly, and that word, though it's not always associated with rejoice, and it only appears once in the New Testament, it appears elsewhere, and it's always associated with the worship of Jesus Christ. It's not the exact word that appears in Luke chapter 2, verse 10, but it does talk about a great joy with the announcement of the coming of Jesus Christ, what we're celebrating at this time of year. This word great is also used in Luke chapter 24, verse 52, in announcing the power of the earth-shattering resurrection, in which they did the work that they had with great joy because they knew that Jesus had conquered the grave. The next time in which this word great is associated with worship is in Acts chapter 8, verse 8, where Philip is in Samaria, and it's the joy that comes from hearing of the preaching of God's word. And it's a marvelous relationship between this great joy that Paul had and his relationship with the Philippians. It's a joy that comes along with the idea of Jesus coming to them, the hope of the resurrection, and the preaching of the gospel. And Paul found this joy because it rested in the work of others. Do you realize, friends, that others should be our greatest joy in Christ and in the church? The relationship of belonging with a family of God, of having others that you can depend on in moments of difficulty. The fact is that if a tornado were to come through Granbury tomorrow and take out this building that we have, Promise Point Church would still exist. Because we don't go to church, we are the church. And we should find our great source of Christian joy from the presence of others, because it's a joy that is nowhere else found in Scripture, as it's a great joy. You know, Paul finds his contentment in people. And what it is that we see is that he is thankful. The antidote to discontentment is always thanksgiving. When we have a complaining heart, it's good for us to sit down and consider afresh the love and graciousness of others and God. You know, there was a great Bible commentary written by a man named Matthew Henry, and a story from his life is that one time as he was walking through London, he was robbed and he was beat up and he was discouraged, and it was all the money that he had. But he went and he sat down, and as was his custom when things would go wrong, he wrote 4 things that he could be thankful for. And the 4 things that he was thankful for was, he was thankful for the fact it was his first time to be robbed. He was thankful that they took his wallet and not his life. He was thankful that there wasn't much in the wallet to begin with. And he was thankful it was him and not somebody else. And he found contentment in what it is that he had. Because can I tell you something, friends? When you appreciate what you have, you don't miss as much as you don't. Because you have a greater sense of possession and God's goodness. Paul was thankful for what he has. And you will desire less if you appreciate more of what you have. Contentment is not a set of ideal circumstances. It's a set of Christian attitudes. And Paul, by the inspiration of the Spirit, wants them not to misunderstand what he was saying. He was happy that the gift met his needs, but because their gift had the motivation of others and their love and concern for him. This is something for us to remember, particularly around this time of the season in which we, as our custom, exchange gifts for the birth of Jesus Christ. Our focus shouldn't be simply upon the physical things that come, but rather the attitude and the gratitude in which they're given. And in this case, Paul was more excited for the credit that would come to their account for the gift than he ever was the gift himself. Because what he realized is a great truth in the Christian life. The things that we give to God and to others, we will never lose. The only stuff we lose is the stuff we keep for ourselves. And what Paul saw was that it was fruitfulness for them, and thus it was a blessing for him. And he rejoiced greatly in the fact that they were willing to give sacrificially to his cause and the advancement of the gospel. And what he had through this providence was the thing that we're focusing on now, which is the art of contentment. For as the next verse says, not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. If any and every circumstance I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. This Greek word for contentment is a word that means to be satisfied, to have enough, and be at a place of sufficiency. This was a virtue back in those days. And it was the highest virtue of a people known as the Stoics, of people who would seek a contentment in their heart. And the Greeks used to seek that which is opposite of greed. The word greed is literally to want more, but the word contentment says, I have enough. Socrates, back in those days, as we look at antiquity, used to write these words. He said, he that is content with least, for contentment is nature's wealth. And that was the wealthiest man, was the one who was content with the least. And we see where Paul is content because his life was not conditioned on anything but Jesus Christ. He was not speaking out of want, meaning that he was self-sufficient or had self-power. He was totally taken care of by Jesus Christ. And he lived out this example for all of us to see and all of us to emulate within our own life. Because Christian contentment is an independence from outward circumstances. It doesn't come from ourselves, but through our dependence upon the Lord. It's all about having sufficiency in Jesus Christ. A content person will never be poor, and a discontented person will never be rich, no matter how much they have. Now, Paul used this idea of discontentment earlier in his relationship with growing in Jesus Christ. And he says, I'm discontent where I'm at in my relationship with him. And here's a big difference that we need to distinguish in order to grow in our Christian walk. Where we need to be content where God has us in our circumstances, we need to be discontent in who we are. We need to continually be wanting him more and more, to grow in our relationship with Jesus Christ, to always be striving towards something that's greater in our walk with him, but yet be content in the circumstances that he gives to us. Because the content Christian is the one who's most unsatisfied with where they are in their relationship with Christ. I've heard it said before that true Christian maturity does not come from eradicating sin from your life, but true Christian maturity comes when you recognize how much actual sin that you do have in your life. It's like the idea, the more I learn, the more I realize how little I know. The more I learn about myself, the more I learn about Christ, the more I realize how short I fall and how much I must be there. And I say that for a purpose. And I say that because many people today are content with who they are, but not content with what they have. Can I say that again? Many people are content with who they are, but not content in what they have, when it should be the opposite. Contentment doesn't come in possessing much, but wanting little. To be like Jesus Christ, who when he died, contained no possessions upon this earth. If you truly want to make a man happy and content, take away his desire for the things of this earth and put his perspective on the things of heaven. Warren Wiersbe once wrote these words: "We cannot control or change the world around us, but we can control the world within us." It has been said that what life does to us depends on what life finds in us. What life should be for the Christian is Christ and the hope of glory, a sense of sufficiency of Jesus Christ who makes us ready for everything. And you know why that Paul could be content? Because he learned, as it says, a secret. "For I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need." This idea of secret has with it the idea of a secret society, somewhere where you learn the different levels to grow in what it is that you know, that you have to be initiated into. The word's in the perfect tense, meaning once you learn it, it's always there as a settled state in our lives. You could call it the secret society of the satisfied. Paul had to learn this in his life. It wasn't something that was gifted unto him. It comes when you are in a place in life where your back's against the wall, where you see heaven the clearest lying flat on your back, in which you experience the things of this world, the difficulties that come, and you find out that Christ is sufficient. Because true contentment is not about where, about what, it's about who. And that who is the person of Jesus Christ. Paul can make it through anything with an invisible means of support because he could be content with little or with much, because regardless he was rich spiritually. You know, the book of Proverbs makes a very interesting statement that I want to read for you here today. And it comes from the book of Proverbs chapter 30 verse 7 through 9. And what it is it's the words of Agur, which comes as a prayer to God. And he says this in verse 7 of chapter 30. "Two things I ask of you. Number one, do not refuse me before I die. Keep deception and lies far from me." And here's number two. "Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is my portion, that I might not be full and deny you and say, 'Who is the Lord?' Or that I not be in want and steal and profane the name of my God." How many of us have ever prayed that prayer? Lord, give me poverty. No, Lord, give me neither poverty nor give me riches. Why does he say that? Because wealth has the ability to take us away from God, as does poverty. He says, Lord, give me my portion. Don't give me more that I can handle or less that I can handle, but give me what is your lot in my life. Because friends, one thing I found as a pastor is that it's easier to be closer to God in poverty and difficulty than it is to be in want or in abundance. The reason why I say that is I've prayed with many people in times of difficulty, and it's amazing how close they are to God. I've never prayed with someone and said, "Thank you for your prosperity." Now, don't get me wrong. God desires for that to be upon his people. However, it's not meant to be the focus of our lives. It's meant to be the offshoot of a life that's lived in obedience to him. Most people find it easy to turn to God in difficult times, but it takes a special person to turn to him in abundance. Warren Wiersbe once said, "Prosperity has done more damage to believers than has adversity." Meaning that when we experience more, it's easy to forget God in our dependence upon him. And Paul says that he's growing richly because of the circumstances that he finds himself in, because his prosperity comes from the riches of knowing Jesus Christ. And God takes care of everything else. This is why God can say, seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, and all these other things, all these details, let me take care of them. You know, it's one time been said that you can give a man everything he wants, and at that moment, everything will not be everything. Because we carry around these sinful bodies that struggle with greed, that struggle with covetousness, that struggle with maintaining God's blessing upon our life through obedience. And because of that, this sin of discontentment follows us oftentimes wherever we go. I heard a story one time about a student who dropped out of Stanford University because of this disgust that he had with being successful and always in a competitive rat race to be number one. So what he did is he went to the Far East, where he joined an environment in a monastery where people would love one another and set aside all of that competitive nature. 6 months later, he wrote a note to his parents, and he said this: I am happy, at peace, not competing for jobs, hustling for grades. All here is equal and shared. We're at harmony with the essence of soul. Right now, I'm number 3 in the leadership and could be number 2 by June. You know, we can change all of our circumstances and everything around us, but it doesn't deal with the sin of discontentment in our lives. The heart of the issue is an issue of the heart. We can change our situations, but the reality is that we need to change our hearts above all else, to view what God has given us in the right perspective as a blessing from him, and that he has us right where he wants us in the moment that we're there, for the purpose that he gives to us. Many men make an art out of living, but never master the art of learning how to live. I heard a story one time about a billionaire who went on vacation down to Cancun. And while he was there, he borrowed a boat to go out fishing. And as he went fishing, he brought it back into the shore, and he saw another fisherman just sitting there on the beach with his boat right there. And he said, well, what are you doing here? There's great fishing going on out there. And he says, well, I've caught enough for today. I don't need any more. And the billionaire, with his mindset, says, why don't you go out there and catch some more, and then you'll have a little bit more, and over time you can buy a second boat, hire a second crew, and then you can get double that, and then you can buy a better boat with nylon nets and catch even more, and then you can have a whole fleet of boats that's going to be getting you everything that you need. And the guy looks at him and he says, well, then what would I do? He says, well, then you take your riches and enjoy your life and relax. He looks at him and he says, what do you think I'm doing now? You know, life isn't about what you have. Life is about what has you. And the reality is that what needs to have us is the person of Jesus Christ. Because our perspective on contentment makes poor men rich and makes discontented men who are rich poor. What is this mystery and how does it accomplish in our lives? Well, that comes in verse 4:13. It's something that can only be learned through hard times and divine instructions. The mystery was that Paul's independence was from dependence upon another. He was in union with Jesus Christ, who can give us sufficiency. For as it says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. This verse is only 6 words in the Greek, and the literal translation is all things I can do and the one who infuses strength into me. All things is in the prime position in this sentence, meaning it's the first thing that we're meant to see. All things, whether good or bad, whether poverty or prosperity, whether no matter what I face, my happiness, my joy, my perspective on life is not based upon what I have, but rather what has me. He would not allow weakness or strength to be an excuse for inactivity in the cause of Christ. The weakness that he had in this situation turned out to be the greatest profit to him, because he surrendered everything he had to Christ, and he found that Christ was sufficient. And he was truly a prosperous and blessed man because he had Jesus above all else. In all things, what's it say? I can do. This is a verb, and it's active, and it means to have strength. You know, elsewhere in the New Testament, it's used to denote the powerful activity of Jesus Christ. Whether it be in 2 Corinthians, when Paul is talking about the thorn in his flesh, and he talks about the power of his grace will be sufficient for Paul. This power involves grace. In Ephesians chapter 3, verse 16, this power is associated with the love of God through Jesus Christ. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 11, it's associated with the power used to strengthen Paul through his difficult situation. And what Paul is saying here in this verb, I can do, is that he can face all conditions and circumstances in life because there is one who is infusing strength into him. His self-sufficiency came from a vital union with the one who is self-sufficient. And that is the source, the one who infuses strength into him. It's in the present tense, meaning it's active. It never stops. That God is continually doing it. And sometimes, friends, we're put in humbling positions and circumstances to learn something of God's love. That there's a depth of God's love that we will never know until we experience it through the difficulties of which Paul is saying, or we acknowledge it in the prosperity that God can give unto us. Corrie ten Boom once said, there's no pit so deep that God's grace cannot reach. And that's the truth. That there is a sufficient amount of power through our relationship with Christ to get us through any circumstance that we may face. And it's a mystery that goes beyond comprehension. And that's the mystery of Jesus Christ. The contentment that he speaks of did not come through the power of positive thinking or anything else. It was Jesus Christ who enables him to be content in all situations. And that's the secret. It's that Christ will infuse power into our souls and strengthen us and satisfy us in all things. And in all things we can accomplish through Jesus Christ. As the band comes up, I'd like to share with you that Paul had told his readers the most important characteristic in life was to be centered on Christ in chapter 2, verse 7 through 11. And the contentment is the fruit of practicing this. I heard a story one time about an airline pilot who flew over a lake and one time says, boy, when I was younger, I used to sit in that boat on that lake and dream of being an airline pilot. And now that I'm an airline pilot, I look at that lake and I dream of being on it on a boat. Can I tell you, friends, if you're looking for contentment in the things of this world, you'll never find it until you meet Jesus Christ and know what true sufficiency is.